Good evening, everyone, and welcome to RHS's first online lecture. We're really excited that our first speaker is former pupil Bob Clarke. Bob was in Raleigh and left in 1968. Now, he describes himself as a business continuity consultant, a trainer, visiting a university lecturer, and best-selling author. But tonight, he's going to be our pandemic specialist. So Bob recalls while most of his classmates went on to the Navy, opted to join the Royal Navy, he freely admits to feeling rather queasy on the Gosport ferry. So he felt that life on the ocean waves was definitely not for him. So instead, he joined the Royal Naval Scientific Service, and he worked at the Admiralty Surface Weapons Establishment, which is located at the top of Portsdown Hill in the south of Portsmouth. It was here he came face to face with his first computer, a second generation Ferranti Poseidon. It was used to control the weapon systems of 4 county-class destroyers, HMS Antrim, Fife, Glamorgan and Norfolk. He found the work fascinating, and it certainly would have a major influence on his future career direction. But with a shrinking Navy and career prospects unlikely at ASWE, by 1973, Bob had joined IBM. And this is where he experienced his first taste of business continuity. Now, although in those days it was solely about recovering organisations of information technology from disaster, unlike today. So over the years that followed, Bob worked in 15 different countries. And it was whilst working in Malta about 10 years ago that he first became aware of tonight's topic, the pandemic threat. Bob's lecture will last for about 40 minutes and then we'll have a 20-minute Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions after the lecture, and we'll try to cover as many questions as we can. Bob has also very kindly offered to put together a blog, which we'll post in a few days' time, which will cover any questions that we haven't asked. So without further ado, please let me invite Bob Clarke to take and share his screen. Over to you, Bob.
Thank you, Lucy, and good evening, everyone. Can I say a big thank you to RHS for inviting me to talk to you this evening. The primary topic I'll be speaking about, of course, is pandemics, as you've heard, something which I could talk about for days, but we've only got 1 hour and we need to allow some time for questions. But before all that, I've been asked to say a few words as to how my career developed after I left the school. Now, before joining the Royal Naval Scientific Service, I nearly became an airline pilot. I passed the selection procedure to go to the College of Air Training at Hamble near Southampton, and I would have gone on to join British Airways. But I failed the Board of Trade Medical as I am apparently colourblind. But as Lucy told you, I went on to work at ASWE, as it's known, where my love affair with computers began. Thinking back, that Royal Naval Poseidon computer I worked with and all its peripheral devices filled a massive room. And yet today, your average smartphone is infinitely more powerful and can be slipped into one's pocket. Such has been the progress of information technology over the years. These are some of the organisations that I've worked with over the years. The longest I've spent with any one employer was the 15 years I was with IBM. For the majority of that time, I was based in and around the Portsmouth area, although in 1978, I did go to Holland on a 2-week business trip, and I came back 3 years later. It was while I was at IBM that I first became familiar with what is now known as business continuity, a subject I still find fascinating after all this time. For those of you unfamiliar with the expression, it's about preparing a plan to deal with any crisis that might befall your organisation, so it can continue to function with as little disruption as possible. So, for example, the crisis could be your head office burning down, a cyber attack, a supply chain failure, an earthquake, a terrorist attack, or the crisis we're currently experiencing, a pandemic. Now, Lucy mentioned I've worked in 15 different countries. In case you're wondering, the time I enjoyed most was when I was working in Rome for the Italian Ministry of Finance, or as it's known in Italian, Dipartimento del Tesoro. My career has developed now into what I would describe as a portfolio career, and it has 4 distinct components. I continue working with clients to offer business continuity consultancy, something I've been doing for many years. That might involve undertaking a review of their current continuity and contingency plans, or if they don't have any, I might end up helping them to go through the plan development process. The commercial training would normally involve running public courses or bespoke courses tailored for a specific client. The topics can cover business continuity management, crisis management, IT disaster recovery, and pandemic planning. Before the pandemic actually kicked off, these courses were all classroom-based, but now we're delivering them all online. I've occasionally been asked to deliver business continuity lectures for both undergraduates and postgraduate tourism students. And finally, I have come to love writing, something which I enjoy, and it's proved to be very successful for me. These are the 4 books that I have published to date, and they all relate in some way to business continuity and crisis management. I have a 5th book with the publisher and 3 others in various states of completion. The book on the left, In Hindsight, was published in 2014, and much to my delight and surprise, it went straight to number 1 on the Amazon bestsellers lists. The sales of the 2nd book from the left, which is all about the pandemic threat, had a very slow start, but has since become a world bestseller. Although I've never served in the Royal Navy, I have been interested in naval history from a very early age. The ship that is pictured is the destroyer HMS Glowworm, which was sunk in March 1940 by the much larger German heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper. The Glowworm's commanding officer was subsequently awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. Now, it was while I was at RHS that I was reading a comic. I believe it was either the Victor or the Valiant, I can't quite remember, and it had an article about the Glowworm's encounter with the Admiral Hipper, which I knew to be factually incorrect. So I wrote a letter to the editor to put him or her straight on the matter. Now, several weeks passed, and I'll be honest, I'd forgotten all about the whole business. Then came the day that the editor made contact. He informed me that my letter was to be published as the Star Letter of the Week, and a postal order for £2 was enclosed. Okay, I know £2 wouldn't buy a cup of coffee in Starbucks these days, but back in the 1960s, that represented the pocket money for an entire term. Suffice to say, I needed no encouragement to continue my writing exploits, again, some of which were actually published. Okay, so why did I write a book about pandemics? I'm the first to admit I'm not a clinician. I'm not a virologist. So what possessed me to do it? I've been aware of the threat of pandemics for quite some time, although to begin with, I guess I didn't appreciate the potential gravity of the threat. Then about 10 or 11 years ago, I facilitated a risk management workshop for the Ministry of Health in Malta. For those of you unaware of Malta's location, it's a group of 5 islands right in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea, about 100 kilometers south of Italy. It was during the workshop that I noticed the participants' body language changed at the mere mention of the word pandemic. They suddenly became very serious. And when we completed the workshop, pandemic was not so much at the top of their list of threats, but it was way out in front. So I took the opportunity to ask the Maltese Chief Medical Officer, that was Natasha Atsopadi-Muscat, why this was. And she left me in no doubt at all about the potential severity of pandemics. A couple of years later, I was invited to develop and deliver a masterclass, first in Hong Kong and then in Dubai. The subject was business continuity and pandemics. Now, while I know my business continuity, I realized I would have to do further research on pandemics, but I accepted the invitation. I can tell you, the more research I did on pandemics, the darker and scarier the subject became. Even so, by the time I'd finished, I had far more material than I could use for that masterclass. So I decided rather than waste it, I would write the book Business Continuity and the Pandemic Threat, which was then my 3rd publication. The subtitle I settled upon was potentially the biggest survival challenge facing organizations, which, with the benefit of hindsight, seems to have been a very appropriate choice. I wrote the book in the style that makes it easy for anyone to understand without requiring a background in medicine or business. It's been described as being conversational in its approach, just as though I was chatting to the reader. I divided it into two parts. The first looked at the history of pandemics going back to the Middle Ages, and it also took a good look at the Spanish flu outbreak of 1918 and 1919, which was the worst influenza outbreak ever. The second part of the book was my own best guess at what I believed a pandemic would look like in the modern era, and what organisations and individuals could do in order to prepare. The only suitable, highly contagious disease from the modern era that I could draw any experience from was a severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS as it's often referred. This disease was the first novel virus of the new millennium. It was spreading rapidly, even before the World Health Organization knew of its existence because of a Chinese cover-up. If nothing else, what SARS taught us is that modern commercial aviation can facilitate the spread of a contagion around the world literally in a matter of hours. The bottom line is that while we cannot stop a pandemic, there may be some mitigation measures or some contingency planning that we can put in place to help. When the book was first published, I think it would be fair to say it got a mixed reception. The medical fraternity were very excited about it, and they embraced the book enthusiastically. In fact, several doctors, to my knowledge, have since referenced it in their own publications. But the business audience, who the book was really aimed at, played it rather cool. Some told me it was too morbid for their tastes. And I'll be honest, I'm not quite sure how you make a book about pandemics into a lighter read. Others told me I'd wasted my time, as the health service would have this covered, wouldn't they? And yes, believe it or not, some people even laughed at me. But then with the growing groundswell of worrying news that was coming out of the Far East, about this time last year in fact, people started to take an interest in my book. It seemed that the predictions I made proved to be very accurate. One of a number of affirming and positive pieces of feedback, which I've since received, you can see that on the screen, was from Robert Preininger. He is a crisis management and business continuity consultant based in Nashville, USA. And it must have been towards the end of March when a delighted publisher contacted me. She said my book was selling even faster than toilet rolls in Tesco, if that was possible. I know the book has been sold around the world, and I understand that the US Homeland Security has even ordered 50 copies. But with the world having discovered my book, I suddenly found myself in demand from as far afield as India to the east, right through to the USA to the west. And my publisher asked me to write a sequel too. Never a dull moment. In fact, I've been far busier than the last 12 months than I have for a very, very long time. The new book is with the publishers, and like its prequel, you do not need any medical or business knowledge to appreciate its contents. Instead of guessing what might happen, as I did with the original, it analyzes what is actually happening now. And where possible, it offers explanations and appropriate courses of action. The cover that you can see on the slide is just a mock-up that will be replaced by a finalized version. While the title is the same as the original book, it's the subtitle that I've changed. Learning from COVID-19 while preparing for the next pandemic. Yes, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen, but this is not the pandemic that the world was necessarily expecting. What is more, history tells us that we can expect more to follow. Maybe we're experiencing today a dress rehearsal for what may come at some future point. The original book had 268 pages. The new one has got 425 and approximately 100,000 words. Quite a few people have contributed in one way or another to helping me write the second book, and this slide is just acknowledging a few of them. Natasha Atsapadi-Muscat is Maltese, and she was the Chief Medical Officer of Malta before moving into the World Health Organization. It was Natasha, remember, that left me in no doubt as to how dangerous pandemics can be. Jonathan Quick and Lisa Kunin are American clinicians, and they both approached me after reading my original book. You may have seen Jonathan, in fact, on television recently. He was featured on BBC News about a week or two back, I think it was. And both Lisa and Jonathan have their own pages on Wikipedia. Status, I guess, that is. Alan Kane, well, he's based at Salford Royal Hospital, and he's kept me very well informed as to what's going on within the NHS. Some of the details you don't necessarily hear about on the BBC or ITV News. And the last name there is Warren Goodall. Now, Warren's been feeding me with useful information about how Australia has been fighting bushfires and floods while COVID has been raging. Because you're facing a crisis doesn't mean there is a moratorium on other crises, and Australia is a point in case. You know, organisations would do well to remember that they could be called upon to deal with more than one crisis at a time, but not everyone appreciates that. The book's got 19 chapters plus appendices, some of which I've listed on this slide. And in the time we have, I would like to talk about as many as possible to give you an insight as to what makes a pandemic tick, I guess. This includes a couple of sections about the school and how it's fared during the pandemic. Now, you might have spotted a chapter called Lockdowns, Saunas and Vodka. Now, let me first tell you that I have largely tried to remain apolitical in writing this book. It will probably come as no surprise when I tell you that was not always easy. But I do take a rather tongue-in-cheek look, I guess, at the somewhat arrogant and unorthodox behaviour of President Bolsonaro in Brazil and President Lukashenko in Belarus. Bolsonaro was telling his country COVID-19 was just like a case of the sniffles, a country where almost 250,000 people have died. Lukashenko, on the other hand, recommended that people should forget about social distancing and just take saunas and drink vodka to ward off the evil virus. Now, I juxtapose the rather flippant pandemic management styles of these gentlemen against New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. You will not win any prizes for guessing which of the three came out best. You may have seen in the news that the World Health Organization has had a team of experts in China trying to establish the cause of the pandemic. There is no question that when the coronavirus exploded in Wuhan, it was China that was caught holding a smoking gun. But did they actually fire the gun in the first place? Officials in China are claiming that the virus arrived there on an imported frozen fish consignment. Well, that might be true. We don't know. Now, I don't know if you've noticed, if you've been following this on the news bulletins, but local officials seem to have been trying very hard to keep the media away from the experts, which makes one wonder whose agenda these experts are actually working to. What you may not know is the World Health Organization originally heard about this new coronavirus via social media and not through official channels. So was this another attempted cover-up by the Chinese, just as they did with SARS in 2002, 2003? China is also guilty of wasting an awful lot of valuable time by censoring the doctor who originally issued the warning about the new virus. Sadly, he subsequently caught it and died. And by the time Wuhan was finally locked down, an estimated 500,000 people had left the city for the Chinese New Year holiday. And I'm sure quite a few of those would have taken the virus with them. So, is it an open and shut case that China is guilty? Well, you may have made your minds up. But here's a few more facts that you might want to consider. At the same time as Wuhan was preparing to go bang, the International Journal of Antimicrobial Agents, which is, I believe, a French publication, they were reporting that SARS was proliferating through the country. COVID-19 was proliferating through France. The University of Siena in Italy was conducting some research on patients with lung cancer. A number of blood samples they took in September of 2019 revealed that around 100 or so of the 900 samples they had contained the coronavirus. And most of those were people that lived in the city of Bergamo, which was where things broke out in a big way in Italy. And then we have the University of Barcelona conducting research on raw sewage. And they found presence of the coronavirus back in March 2019. So what we're looking at here is a virus which didn't just happen in December or thereabouts. It's been around a while. Now, those of you that are aware of HIV, AIDS and the massive explosion that we saw in the 1980s may have thought that's when it started. But HIV AIDS has actually been traced back to Cameroon in 1910. So it had been around 60 years before anyone really noticed. Is that the same with this coronavirus? Well, maybe time will tell. I've heard people complaining that we didn't get any warning about the pandemic. I'm afraid that is simply not true. We have had a constant stream of warnings ever since the arrival of the new millennium. But sadly, not many people were listening. Some were. Those countries that experienced outbreaks of SARS, so Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, Taiwan, they've practiced what they preached. They've practiced what they learnt, and they have been the better for it when you look at the statistics for COVID outbreaks. Now, here are just 4 examples compared with COVID-19. When we look at the SARS outbreak in 2002, 2003, that was really just a drop in the ocean, but it was described as an economic tsunami in terms of the cost to those countries affected. Less than 10,000 people actually caught the disease, and only 776 died. Compared with today's statistics that we're seeing, that is insignificant. There were 6 global hotspots. Hong Kong, Beijing, Singapore, Taiwan, Hanoi, and Toronto in Canada. So that was a wake-up call. We've got Bill Gates. For some reason, when you mention Bill Gates, a lot of people seem to go boo, hiss, and all the rest of it, which I don't really understand. The guy's doing a lot of good work, in my view. In 2015, he gave a TED education talk, which is available on YouTube if you want to see it. And it's called The Next Outbreak. We Are Not Ready. Did anyone see it? Well, according to the statistics on the TED website, around 40 million people have seen the video. If you go and see the corresponding copy on YouTube, around 30 million plus. So a lot of people have seen that video. But did anyone take any notice and do anything about it? 2016, I published my book, which I hope might add a little bit of weight to the cacophony of noise that was out there that no one was hearing. And then in the UK, we've got the National Risk Register of Civil Emergencies. You may or you may not have come across that. I just want to talk about that briefly. It's in the public domain, so you can download a free copy if you desire. It's revised and reissued every 2 or 3 years, I guess. And what we're looking at there is the 2017 version, although there is now a 2020 version, which has just come out in the last few weeks. Not quite sure why it came out in 2021, but there we are. It is a very readable document. It's not quite Enid Blyton standard, but it is readable. And it highlights the threats that the UK believes could cause a civil emergency. That does not mean they're going to happen, as risk management is not, it's not really an exact science. There is a degree of finger in the air when you're doing your assessments. But needless to say, the subject of pandemics gets more than just a passing mention. If you turn to page 9 of that document, you'll come across this matrix. And that's a risk assessment matrix. On the left-hand side, we have a pictorial map of all the threats represented by a series of symbols. I like pictures myself, so I'm really comfortable with this. The 2021, I've glanced at, they're all numbers, so I don't like that so much. On the right-hand side is a legend, or a key if you prefer, of what the symbols mean. The higher up the chart a symbol is positioned, the greater the expected impact if the threat actually materializes. The nearer the symbol is to the right-hand side of the chart, the greater the probability of it happening. Okay. We're interested in those two. The top one is pandemic influenza. And the yellow triangle, I think it is, remember I'm colorblind, that's emerging infectious diseases. Why are we not prepared for emerging infectious diseases? Because until they hit us, we don't know about them. And as far as COVID-19 is concerned, we didn't, as a global community, we didn't get much warning that it was going to occur. If you're wondering, terrorism and cyber attacks and all good things like that won't mention, that's because they're on a separate page. So if you'd like a copy, as I say, it's free. Just Google UK National Risk Register and you can download a PDF file to peruse at your convenience. And this is the new one which has just recently come out. They're both available, so I'd recommend if you're interested in this, take a look. So why on earth do I talk about the Royal Hospital School in a book about pandemics? When I say that education has been seriously impacted by the pandemic, I would like to think that I'm preaching to the converted. Because of the severity of the situation, I devoted a chapter to the subject that looks across age ranges from reception age, so it's 4 years old, right up to and including university level. One of the schools I looked at is a Chinese school in Hangzhou in China. I think that's how you pronounce it. Another one here in the UK, located in an area of high deprivation, where only 47% of the children's mother tongue is English. I also looked at RHS. In fact, I've been chatting with a few of my old housemates recently, and I told one of them about this webinar and about my second book about pandemics. He asked me if I'd mentioned the school in my book for nostalgic reasons. Well, I can tell you the answer to that is a very big no. The school is in the book because it deserves to be there. I've been very impressed with the way the school has first prepared for and then managed the pandemic. How many other schools went into lockdown on Friday, 20th of March, I think it was, and then seamlessly commenced online teaching of 750 pupils in 38 countries, 28 different subjects, I believe it was, on the following Monday. I can tell you there are still businesses out there today that still haven't got their working from home strategies sorted, and that's almost 12 months after the pandemic started. Businesses can learn a lot from what RHS has achieved. Testing and tracing. Well, there's two types of tests, which you may know. One is for antibodies and the other is for a viral test. The first test tells you whether you've been infected in the past. You might have been asymptomatic, of course, so you wouldn't necessarily have known. The second establishes, are you currently infected? Initially in the UK, we struggled to get an effective testing program up and running. The government made several performance commitments that it failed to meet. However, you might be surprised to learn that by the end of 2020, the UK was out-testing the rest of the world per capita. You might also like to know that the UK is pioneering trials using dogs that can be deployed, for example, at airports to provide unintrusive testing. You probably know that dogs are already used for detecting cancer in patients, and using them for COVID is just applying the same concept. The NHS, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicines, Durham University, and the Medical Detection Dog Charity, they're all involved in this program. I think they're very hopeful that it's going to bear fruit. As for tracing, there have been a variation of approaches used across the world, although probably the most effective has been the use of smartphones in China. That said, it would not work in the Western world because there will be simply two demands: that civil liberties are to be maintained and data protection is to be observed. I think we need a long, hard look at how we do tracing in the future. I'm not just talking about the UK, I'm talking about the democratic countries of the world. Vaccinations. Now, I'm based in Manchester, and the northwest and the northeast are apparently doing the trailblazing in terms of the percentage of people that have been vaccinated. And I had my first vaccination today, which was the Pfizer version. I've got to say the whole process ran like clockwork. And so far, I'm not feeling any side effects. Watch this space, of course. But this pandemic, had it occurred 10 or 15 years ago, it is highly likely that we would still be waiting for a vaccine. It's only been new, recently developed vaccine technologies that have allowed us to make such rapid progress. And in fact, it's been so fast that a lot of people have said, can they really produce a vaccine and test it thoroughly in the time? Well, the answer is yes. And the approach they've used in some cases has really been impressive. So with the vaccination count expected to reach 15 million, I think it is, by Monday, you may be surprised to have heard about the strict new measures for travellers coming back into the country. Personally, I believe that we need such measures, and to be honest, we needed them in place 12 months ago. Unfortunately, it's not just the UK that we need to worry about. It's the rest of the world too. And the World Health Organization estimates that around, I think it's 5.4 billion people will need to be vaccinated before we can globally start to relax. Now, with manufacturers expecting to make around 2.6 billion doses every year, it's likely to be well into 2023 or even 2024 before that vaccination program is complete. So in answer to the original question on the slide, vaccines, are they a silver bullet? I'm afraid the answer is no. Have you noticed we have had some new words and expressions enter the English language since the pandemic started? Let's Zoom next week. You're on mute. A COVID cut, describing someone who's cut their own hair out of sheer desperation because they can't get to the hairdressers. And a blurs day, which doesn't necessarily have anything to do with alcohol. Another word is infodemic. I beg your pardon. I'll come on to that slide in a minute. I want to talk about infodemic. There is so much misinformation, or fake news if you prefer, out there. Honestly, you could write a book just about conspiracy theories. Was the coronavirus the result of biological warfare? Wasn't it caused by 5G radiation? Aren't vaccines really safe, or do they contain microchips? I think this is where Bill Gates comes in somehow. We often see people flouting the COVID regulations with mass gatherings or partying. It's as if they're immune to the virus. And then even if those people that believe the pandemic is all one big hoax, you know, they go around hospitals trying to take photographs of empty corridors and things just to say, well, there's no one there. So I guess my message to you is, please be aware that there is so much misinformation out there, especially on social media. I'd like to suggest that before you share any COVID-related information, that you just give some thought to its origins and its authenticity before you retweet it or share it with your friends and followers. You could really help the world become a much better place, and a safer place for that matter. It's an ill wind. I find this expression interesting because it's like an oxymoron, I think. Financial Times reported that the online organisation Amazon, which I'm sure you've all heard, doubled its quarterly profits while it hired 175,000 new employees during the pandemic. Yeah, lockdown shoppers drove sales 40% higher year on year to 88.9 billion. So it helped the company record a 5.2 billion net income for the first 3 months to June. So, Netflix. They've added 16 million subscribers during the first quarter of 2020 when the pandemic had hardly taken off. And that was double the company's own forecast for the period. In 2019, Zoom. I know today we're on Microsoft Teams, but Zoom. They had around 10 million daily participants on the platform. By March, that had risen to 200 million. And by April, just a month later, it was up to 300 million. In the UK, while online retailers like ASOS, as seen on screen, they saw a massive upswing in sales. But those high street outlets without an online presence will be very lucky to survive. For example, the demise of Arcadia will leave quite a few empty spaces on the high street. But as you can see from the chart on the screen, share prices from March to December, despite the peak for Amazon and Netflix was higher, I think that was in August, they peaked, they were still, come December, double what they were in March. When it came to Zoom, that was treble. So, what did I get wrong in the book? Okay, influenza. I thought that was going to be the pandemic, although that could still happen. Influenza is nasty, but it's only a respiratory disease. COVID-19 is a multi-system disease and it can attack just about any organ in the body and leave it scarred. I've included 2 cases in the book about long COVID. It's like a post-viral fatigue, or in fact it's probably worse than that, where patients are no longer infected, but most, if not all, the symptoms still linger. One of the cases was declared that I've used as a case study infection-free in August, and the other one was September. They are both still suffering. The second point there, I very much underestimated the number of people that we placed into isolation or lockdown. But during the SARS outbreak, so 2002, 2003, 50,000 people were quarantined primarily in Beijing and Toronto. Now, while I expected something similar, the sheer volume of people simultaneously locking down at one point must have been approaching 2 billion, especially when all of India went into lockdown, as China already had a large a portion of the country in lockdown too. And the last point I've put there, a lack of global consolidation and the extent of nationalistic isolation. I think that's more of a disappointment than something I got wrong. We've seen the disunited states of America and effectively no central leadership. We've occasionally seen EU was not always been working in harmony. The recent business about the AstraZeneca vaccines and the threat to disregard Brexit Northern Ireland border clause, certainly it's done them no favours as far as that's concerned. They've had to do a lot of backpedaling on that one. So those are the 3 key ones. I'm sure there are other smaller points that I've underestimated or they haven't happened or things I've missed, etc. But those, for me, are the key ones. If we are going round wearing our face masks, and even though I've been vaccinated today, when I've had my second vaccine, I will still be expected to wear a face mask. I will still be expected to practice social distancing. So the primary method of being infected is by what we touch, and then by touching our face to allow the virus to enter our body. On the screen at the moment, we've just got some examples of how you can be infected. Touching a door handle, which someone has contaminated, a stair rail, a trolley in a supermarket, lift buttons, and so on. These are all things that we need to be very much aware of. Okay, they are potential dangers. So, I'm coming up to my 40 minutes. And allow some time for questioning. My message to you, ladies and gentlemen, Stay safe as best you can. Please carry on social distancing. I love the two phones together. Perfect example of social distancing. Which leads me to say, any questions?
Lovely, thank you, Bob. That was really, really fascinating. And I would say that I would recommend Bob's book. I have to say I read it and it reads like a movie script. Brilliant. Okay, well, we have a couple of questions, which is good. So anyone else, please do post your questions on the Q&A section. So we've got a question. Do you see any positives coming out of the pandemic? There's so much negativity in the
that's a fair comment. There is. Well, one of the positives, we're not seeing many colds or flu this year because people are social distancing, because people are wearing masks, or most people are, because we're conscious to keep washing our hands. We're doing ourselves a favour in terms of we're denying flu and cold bugs to do their worst. So that's one point. A lot of organisations on an individual basis have changed the way they've operated because of the virus, and they've discovered, well, actually, I think we're going to carry on doing this. A very simple example of a school. One of the head teachers I was talking to said the children used to queue up at the hatch to get their lunch. They don't do that anymore. They are sent to their tables when they arrive in the dining room. They sit in their bubble, in their classroom bubble, and their lunch is brought to them. And she said, it's a much nicer experience for them. So we're going to carry on doing it. When it comes to working from home, one of the first things organisations that I have worked with, in fact, let me backtrack a minute. Some organisations decided they weren't going to do anything positive about preparing for a pandemic until they knew one was coming. The trouble is you don't get much warning. We had in this UK, before we went into lockdown, less than 2 months warning from the time of Wuhan going bang to us going into lockdown. So all those organisations that said, well, we're going to need some form of PPE, we're going to need extra laptops and tablets for people to work from home, and the shelves were bare because other people have got there first. So we have major supply chain issues. The factory of the world, in case you hadn't noticed, is China. And the Chinese were all having holiday, thank you very much. And in fact, one manufacturer that I'm aware of in China, which is a big PPE manufacturer, they actually called their employees back because the demand for PPE was so great. So I think one of the things that's come out of that is realizing that the stock of PPE that you need, and this is not specifically aimed at the UK, this is the world in general, has got to be far greater than what had been anticipated. But on positive side, I've seen a number of SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. They can't carry on doing what they would normally do because they weren't considered to be essential, or they couldn't work from home or whatever. One guy, he was an entrepreneur, and he'd organised an event in Portsmouth where he had something like 100 different types of chili. I didn't know there was so many that existed. And he was making gin from these, and there was going to be some kind of event going on. I'm just trying to remember the details. That was cancelled. What was going to do with all these chilies? He started making jam, which sold very nicely, thank you. A hairdresser I know, some hairdressers have been a bit naughty, and they've been going around knocking on people's doors and saying, can I cut your hair? I won't tell if you don't. But she wasn't prepared to do that. And she has found, I wouldn't be at all surprised if she gave up being a hairdresser, because she's found it very lucrative actually selling ladies' lingerie online.
Yeah, there are definitely some winners, aren't there? There really are.
There are. There are some people that have certainly said, "Oh, do I just sit here and woe is me, or is there something I can actually do? Is there something positive? Can I change my business model?" Another case study that comes to mind, not far from where I live, there's a couple that have an American diner. So they're closed down like everyone else, and they think, what are we going to do? They didn't do takeaways at that point in time. And they realized that after about 2 days that they had a hatch at the front of their, or a window that would open like a hatch. And now they have been doing a roaring trade. So much so as they're seen as an essential part of the local community. But it was all because they thought about changing their business model. But other businesses that, if you go and collect takeaway, you've got to go into the premises. That was something you couldn't do, and you still can't.
Yeah.
So to some extent, it's having the presence of mind to say, well, instead of doing that, we can do this. And in the case of this diner, they had the facility to be able to offer a safe takeaway option. So there are lots of little stories like that, which I've included in the book.
I've got quite a few questions coming in. Wow.
Okay.
Gosh. Okay, so I do have a question. Someone's written this about your comic, actually. This is Andrew Matthews. So he's saying, how did Bob manage to read a comic at school? They were banned.
Not in the 60s, they weren't.
Oh, okay.
Shall we say they were vetted?
Okay, all right, that's good. Next question is, are you working with or helping to inform the UK response to COVID?
I haven't had time to do anything like that, to be perfectly honest. The last year has been manic, and my other half will tell you that she has occasionally said, "Can I make an appointment to see you?" I kid you not. So anything like that, I just haven't been able to get involved with. I'm talking regularly to my contacts in the NHS, one of which I mentioned in the acknowledgements earlier in the presentation. So people are getting the benefit of my research. I had a long discussion with the Rockefeller Foundation, people there, because they're looking to see what they can do in terms of not so much the here and now, but prevention and management of future pandemics. So most of, I suppose, my involvement has not been in the UK, it's been in the USA. Not that I've been travelling there, I hasten to add.
No. Well, that leads nicely on to our next one, which is how do we prepare for the next pandemic?
Someone said to me, must have been about April, May time, is it about time we started doing a review? What are the lessons that we can learn? Well, while we can learn little bits and pieces as we go along, and we're going to change the way we do things as we think, well, actually, that's a better way of doing it than what we were doing before. The real lessons will be learned when the pandemic is over. And globally, we need to look at that bigger picture and say, what do we need to do as a civilization? Not just the UK, not just China, not just the USA, but collectively, what do we need to do? So my fear is, they say a week is a long time in politics. And when the pandemic is over, are we going to see politicians say, oh, thank God that's over. Well, what are we doing next? And they don't actually act upon the lessons that we're learning.
Yeah.
It is clear to me that places like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Singapore, they have learnt the lessons from SARS. Taiwan has not even been into lockdown yet. One of the few countries.
Is that because they closed their borders?
They closed their borders. They isolated anyone coming into the country. I think they've had one, maybe two community transmitted cases of COVID in the last 8 months. That's pretty impressive.
Yeah, it is definitely. Okay, I've got a question from John McCorkadale. Is the Western liberal model, demographic and density, the reason for the UK's death rate? And was the early governmental strategy fair, given the lack of knowledge?
Yeah, good question. In terms of the actual death rate, which is scary in itself, I think the jury is still out in terms of why. Because if you look at, I never mentioned this in the presentation, John Hopkins University in the States, they've got a very good medical faculty. And in October 2019, they published what they called the World Global Health Security Index, something like that. And they rated every country in the world across 6 criteria. And one of those criteria was how ready were you to face an epidemic or a pandemic. And every country was marked out of 100. The country top in that category was the UK at 91%. Second was the USA at 79%. But neither of those countries have exactly covered themselves in glory in terms of how we've managed the pandemic. Why so many people have died in the UK? I think some serious questions need to be asked. Some people will say it's because of deprivation. Some people will say it's because of diet. Some people will say it's because of obesity. You know, there are lots of reasons that we need to consider. And I think that we're going to see a lot of research. Well, some of it's already been done, but a lot of research continue beyond the end of the pandemic in terms of why. Because at the moment, I think there's a lot of guessing and there's no substance behind some of the arguments that are being put forward. So hopefully that doesn't answer the question, but hopefully it'll give you some flavour. Sorry, there was a second part to it, wasn't there?
It was the early governmental strategy fair given the lack of knowledge?
There was no set of, there wasn't a playbook, I think is the expression that's often used, to say this is what we do when we get hit by a coronavirus. Because the only countries, with the exception of Toronto and Canada, the only countries that have been hit by a coronavirus before have been Middle East or Asian. So this is why they have fared better, because they've been better prepared. We were ready for an influenza pandemic. It didn't come. And what we're dealing with is far more vicious. So the pressure it puts on the health service, for example, is probably far greater than influenza would in terms of the way you treat people. Did we do a good job? Well, like every other country, we were sticking our wet finger in the air and thinking, what do we do next? And some people would argue that politicians weren't probably the best people to actually make the decisions that needed to be made. In Japan, the politicians were so slow that it was the scientists that actually kicked things off. And to begin with, things were going very well in Japan. But I think I may stand corrected on this, but I perceive, and it is perception, I hasten to add, that when the politicians did get involved, things started to go downhill. Yeah. So who's the best person to manage it? We see regular briefings from Downing Street. And one of the things that the various government ministers have got to decide upon is, of the recommendations that come from Saga Group, what are they going to act upon? Because they're not always unanimous. Mm-hmm. Anyone that works with any academics will know that they like to debate. And if you get 10 academics in a room, you may get 10 different opinions on the same subject. So it's not black and white in terms of this is a unanimous recommendation that's coming out of the various scientific groups in the world. So it's a tough call.
Yeah.
And this is why I'm scared that politicians will say, well, that's it, we can move on now when it's all over, and they don't learn from the lessons. That's critical.
Absolutely. I've got a really good question here from Brian Corner. Many people normally see business continuity as a relatively short-term measure. With the arrival of multiple variants of COVID and such a long duration for vaccine rollout, are we really experiencing business continuity or a complete reframing of business practice?
Bit of both, I guess.
Mm.
First, business continuity is not a short-term thing. Business continuity is something which it should go through a process of continuous improvement. Now, if you look at the Business Continuity Institute's good practice guidelines, they recommend that some threats, and obviously the pandemic is a threat, actually deserve the development of their own contingency plans. So that is something which organisations should be doing. In this country, we don't generally have any trouble with earthquakes. So I don't see the point in us developing contingency plans for earthquakes. Italy, well, that's a different matter. Mm. So we should each be looking, whether it's at country level, and this is where the National Risk Register comes in that I've talked about, whether it's at organisational level, we should be looking at, so what are the threats that keep us awake at night? And what can we be doing to actually mitigate, or what contingency measures can we come up with to give us an easier time sleeping? So business continuity should never be looked upon as just a short-term thing. You know, it's something which I find it sad that some organisations will develop their strategic plan, they'll put together their budget, they'll perhaps come up with marketing strategies for their products and services, and when push comes to a shove, they don't have a plan to actually recover from any crisis that may befall them.
Yeah.
And that's tragic.
Yeah, actually, someone's actually asking another good question, which is, what are your thoughts on vocational education gaps? As much of the students have not had full hands-on experience, do you think there will be gaps in skilled trades further down the line?
Yeah, that's a good one. I haven't really thought about that one. So this is going to be off the cuff.
Yeah.
One of the things that a head teacher that I featured in the book actually said to me is that I think the children are far more resilient than the staff, suggesting that children are far better than we adults. So they might surprise us. And despite the fact that I read something fairly recently about a woman who lost 4 years worth of school because of the Balkan crisis, where Yugoslavia was splitting up and there was civil war and so on and so forth. She now has the career of her choice. She is highly qualified. She went to Australia, I think that was the story. So we shouldn't give up on people just because they have missed education. But certainly it may be necessary to look at some kind of initiative to say, is there some kind of gap that we need to manage here, and how are we going to do it? Just throwing money at it is not the way to do it. It needs to be some kind of strategic plan to say, what are we trying to achieve? How are we going to get there? And let's put a plan together to make it happen. One other point that I suppose is relevant, my mother, bless her, she was almost 96 when she died. As a child, her father had been in the Royal Air Force and she went to 14 different schools. Mm. So her continuity of education didn't exist. Oh, look at the time, perhaps I should be changing schools. You know, that seemed to be the way of life that she was leading.
Yeah. Yeah, but I think as you say, I think they are very resilient and they will bounce back. I don't think
it never held her back.
Lost generation.
Yeah.
You know, I've got one at university and one in year 12, and I think they'll be absolutely fine. I definitely think they'll be fine. It is 2032, but if you're okay to answer maybe one more question.
Yeah, please go.
If that's all right. Mm-hmm. So the current response to COVID has cost the UK 350 billion plus.
And counting.
How and what will have to change to be able to afford a second pandemic? Wow, that's never...
Can we afford another pandemic? Yeah. The reality is we don't get the choice. Well, I've actually written a section in the book called Who's Going to Pay for This?
Oh, have you? Right.
Yes, I have. And those lovely little children that are at school are going to be paying for it for the rest of their lives, I suspect. We have only just, in the last decade, finished paying for World War I and World War II. Now we've got the payment for the conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq to pay for. We've got the banking crisis we're still going to be paying for, and now we're throwing the pandemic cost on top of that, which actually vastly outweighs the rest of the debt that we had. We're not finished paying yet. That debt is going to continue growing. And what it means is that we are going to have to repaying that debt. And all the time we're repaying that debt, there will be other things. Maybe there's social programs, maybe there'll be something to do with the health service, maybe the defence projects. They are not going to get necessarily the budgets that they need because we're repaying for the pandemic. And that's the reality of it. I mean, I'm not a specialist in economics, but that just seems to be the logic that I would follow. And as I say, it's the younger generation that may still be in reception classes at school. They're going to be paying for this for a long time.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Right, well, we do have actually, unbelievable, 26 questions still waiting. So you're going to be very busy with your blog.
I should look forward to it.
Yeah, those are really interesting questions. So
just to reiterate what we were discussing earlier, if anyone goes away after this and thinks, oh, I should have asked that question, if they can send them in to you, and if we can include those in the blog, then let's do it.
Yes, absolutely. So maybe if we plan to try and get the blog out next week, because I think you might need some time to answer these questions. We've now got 27 questions. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bob. It's been really fascinating.
My pleasure, Lucy.
Thank you very much for all the questions. Thank you to Joe in our eyes.
A big thank you to Joe, yes, for keeping us going and putting us back on the straight and narrow when we fell off.
No, that's wonderful. So thank you very much, everyone. I hope you've enjoyed listening to Bob, and we'll keep you posted about our next lecture, which will be Ian Annett, who is Deputy CEO of the UK Space Agency. So thank you very much and good night.